Today, we're diving into a really pivotal and often painful chapter of history. We're talking about the story of how a global push towards modernization led to the displacement of indigenous peoples, especially across North America and Australia. And this wasn't just a fight over land. It was a head-on collision between two completely different ways of seeing the world, and its consequences are still echoing today. And really, to get to the heart of this story, you have to start with this incredibly profound question from Chief Seattle back in 1854. How can you buy or sell the sky, the warmth of the land? I mean, that one question just perfectly captures the fundamental, almost unbridgeable gap in understanding that defined this whole era. So, where does a story like this even begin? Well, it starts with European imperialism. Starting around the 18th century, European powers were basically in a global race, aggressively expanding their empires and their influence all across the planet. And this, of course, led to the meeting of these two vastly different worlds. At the absolute center of this expansion are the folks we call settlers. Now, what does that actually mean? A settler is someone who moves to a new place with the plan to stay, to put down permanent roots. But in doing so, they very often displace the people who are already living there. For this story, we're talking about Europeans heading to the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand. So what was driving this massive movement of people? Well, it was a really powerful mix of things. On the economic side, they were looking for profit, from trading things like fish and furs, finding resources. Politically, they wanted to grab land, set up colonies, and just expand their empires. And for a lot of them, there was also this very strong religious drive to spread Christianity. Okay, so let's see how this all played out. And we'll start in North America. For the European settlers showing up, they saw it as the new frontier, this huge, seemingly empty land just overflowing with opportunity. But, of course, it was anything but empty. The reality on the ground was that people had been living in North America for over 30,000 years. And these weren't simple, uniform societies. We're talking about a rich tapestry of hundreds of unique cultures and languages, each with a deep, sustainable connection to the land that had lasted for millennia. And this is where we get to the absolute core of the conflict. It was a profound clash of perceptions. It wasn't just a disagreement over a contract or a border. It was a complete, fundamental inability to see the world in the same way. And wow, does this lay it out clearly. For Native peoples, when you exchanged goods, they were considered gifts. The whole point was to build relationships, to foster friendship. But for Europeans, goods were commodities, plain and simple, things you buy and sell to make a profit. And the biggest difference of all, the one that changed everything? Land. To indigenous communities, land was communal. It was sacred. It wasn't something a person could own. To the settlers, land was private property, a resource to be chopped up, bought, sold, and used. So you see, while a lot of the first encounters were actually friendly, like in this sort of romanticized image of immigrants being welcomed, they were built on a huge misunderstanding. The native people thought they were exchanging gifts, making friends. The Europeans thought they were making a business deal, staking a claim. And if you had any romantic ideas about this era, this quote from the American author Washington Irving really cuts through it. He saw what was happening with his own eyes, and he wrote that some white men treated the poor Indians as little better than animals. This wasn't some fringe idea. It was an attitude that would be used to justify so much of what was to come. And what came next was that great push westward. This relentless expansion was fueled by the idea that if land wasn't fenced off and turned into private farms, it was basically unused and therefore it was up for grabs. Just look at the scale of this on the map. After 1783, the United States just exploded across the continent. Huge chunks of land were bought, like the massive Louisiana Purchase from France. Other areas were won through wars, like the territory taken from Mexico. And in all of this, the native inhabitants were rarely, if ever, even asked. And this timeline, it really shows you the key moments that just poured gasoline on the fire. You have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which instantly doubled the size of the country. Then boom, the California Gold Rush hits in 1849, and a massive wave of people heads west. And by 1870, the Transcontinental Railway makes it easier than ever, sealing the fate of the frontier. Just 22 years later, it's officially declared closed. So we've seen the maps, we've seen the timelines, the scale of this expansion. But the real question, the one that truly matters, is what was the human impact? What was the cost? This data, it tells a devastating story. Just look at the native population in the USA in 1820 compared to Spanish America only 2 decades earlier. The difference is just staggering. 0.6 million versus 7.5 million. It really points to a huge difference in colonial strategy. The US policy was all about settler colonialism, replacing the existing population, and it was just far more destructive to indigenous life than the Spanish model, which was more focused on extraction. A huge part of that policy was forced removal. And the justification the US government used was that Native people weren't using the land to its full potential because they weren't farming it in the European style. So thousands were forced from their ancestral homes. The most infamous example is the Cherokee Nation, forced onto the brutal Trail of Tears, a forced march west where more than a quarter of them died along the way. Okay, so now we're going to pivot halfway across the world to Australia. It's a distant continent, but a very similar story of displacement was unfolding there, just with its own unique and, frankly, brutal logic. The entire British claim to Australia was built on this one legal idea, terra nullius. It's Latin, and it means land belonging to nobody. By just declaring the whole continent empty, the British completely and deliberately ignored the fact that Aboriginal peoples had been living there for over 40,000 years. And so, on that very foundation, European Australia was built. It started out as a penal colony in 1788, then got supercharged by gold rushes in the 1850s, and eventually, it all came together as the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. And all of this development was happening on land that was home to somewhere between 350 and 750 distinct Aboriginal societies. For centuries, these stories of displacement were pretty much just swept under the rug by the colonizing powers. But in the 20th century, you start to see the winds of change. A slow, difficult, and still ongoing process of acknowledging these deep historical injustices finally began. And this table, it's pretty chilling when you look at it. It reveals the logic of colonialism, how different specific justifications were basically invented to deny rights to different groups. For Native Americans, the excuse was that they were too primitive to be citizens. For people in India under British rule, they were supposedly not ready for self-government. Each rationalization was tailor-made to fit the colonial goal. But, after long, hard struggles, perspectives did start to shift. In the U.S., the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act was a huge deal. It finally gave natives on reservations some basic rights to manage their own land. Much later, in 1982, Canada's Constitution Act formally recognized Aboriginal rights. And in Australia, starting in the 70s, a new policy of multiculturalism began to challenge what one historian famously called the Great Australian Silence on the country's Aboriginal history. And that really brings us to our final and most crucial point. These aren't just stories from the past, right? They are the foundational narratives that are still shaping these nations today. So, the question we're left with, the one to really think about, is how do these historical accounts of settlement, expansion, and displacement continue to influence a nation's identity and the ongoing fight for justice right now, in the present?